The Unsung Hero, A Black Soldier's Betrayal. Chapter 1, Call to War. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and fear. The world teetered on the edge of chaos, and like many young men, Elijah Carter found himself standing at the crossroads of destiny. War had come, and with it the call to arms. A young African-American soldier from a small southern town, Elijah had enlisted with hopes of proving his worth in a nation that barely acknowledged his existence. He longed to fight for a country that did not fully embrace him, to carve out his own identity in a world that often denied him the right to exist freely. The news arrived in the form of a crisp letter, orders to report for duty. It was official now. The weight of responsibility settled onto his shoulders as he held the parchment in trembling hands. His mother wept silently as he packed his meager belongings, her tears soaking into the fabric of his only good shirt. His father, a man of few words, hardened by years of injustice and toil, merely nodded, the weight of generations resting on his weary frame. They both knew the dangers Elijah faced, not only from enemy fire, but also from the very men who were supposed to be his brothers in arms. Yet, there was no hesitation in his heart. This was more than just a war. It was his chance to break the chains of prejudice, to carve out a legacy where his name would not be forgotten. As he boarded the train bound for the training camp, he met men of all backgrounds, some eyeing him with suspicion, others offering wary nods of acknowledgement. White soldiers clustered together, speaking in hushed tones, casting glances in his direction. Some were indifferent, but others wore expressions of open hostility. The reality of segregation followed him even in the military: separate barracks, separate dining areas, and a clear divide between the white officers and the black soldiers. Still, he remained steadfast, knowing that battlefields do not discriminate between the fallen. The rhythmic chugging of the locomotive and the whistle of the wind through the open windows filled the silence between soldiers. Some played cards to pass the time, while others polished their boots, preparing for the unknown challenges ahead. Elijah stared out at the passing countryside, his mind a battlefield of its own, thoughts of home clashing with visions of war. Would he return? Would he make his family proud? Or would he become another forgotten soldier, lost in the tide of history? Upon arriving at the training camp, reality struck harder than he had anticipated. Drill instructors barked orders, their voices sharp as bayonets. The grueling routine of early morning runs, combat drills, and endless lectures tested the limits of every man present. But for Elijah, there was an additional battle, a battle for respect. While his fellow black soldiers trained just as hard, if not harder, they were often assigned the most laborious tasks, given outdated equipment, and overlooked for promotions. One evening, after an exhausting day of drills, Elijah sat on his bunk, rubbing his sore muscles, when a fellow soldier, Thomas Whitaker, a white man from the Midwest, approached him. "You got a mean shot, Carter," he admitted, tossing Elijah a small tin of tobacco as a peace offering. "I saw you at the range. Bet you could outshoot half the men in this camp." Elijah hesitated before nodding in gratitude. Trust was not given easily in times like these, but something about Thomas felt genuine. In the coming weeks, the two would form an unspoken bond, one built on survival rather than skin color. Still, tension simmered beneath the surface. Not everyone approved of Thomas's friendly nature toward a black soldier. One night, as Elijah cleaned his rifle, a group of white soldiers walked by, one of them muttering, "Don't waste your time, Whitaker. He won't last long anyway." Elisha pretended not to hear, but the words cut deep. He was no stranger to prejudice, but here, in the military, a place where men were supposed to stand side by side as equals, it stung in a way he hadn't expected. Despite these struggles, Elijah pressed on. He excelled in marksmanship, his sharp shooting skills gaining quiet recognition among his peers. Though the officers rarely praised him openly, he noticed the occasional nod of approval from the sergeants during training exercises. It wasn't much, but it was something. Then the day of reckoning arrived. Deployment orders were issued. The air buzzed with nervous energy as soldiers packed their gear, checked their weapons, and prepared themselves for the unknown. Elijah felt his heart hammer against his ribs as he strapped on his gear, his hands steady but his mind racing. This was what he had trained for. This was his moment. As he stepped onto the transport ship, the enormity of it all settled in. The war was real, the danger was imminent, and despite all the discrimination he had faced, he was ready to fight for his country, for his family, and most of all, for himself. Little did he know that the greatest battle he would face would not be against the enemy, but against betrayal from within his own ranks. Chapter 2. The Hour of Departure. The sun had barely risen when the call came, deployment orders. The barracks erupted in chaos as soldiers rushed to gather their gear. The air was thick with tension, a mix of excitement and dread weaving through the ranks. Elijah stood among them, his heart pounding, his hands gripping his rifle with a mixture of fear and determination. This was it, the moment he had trained for. The transport ship loomed ahead, its steel hull a silent guardian against the perils of war. As the soldiers climbed aboard, Elijah caught the gaze of Thomas Whitaker, a fellow soldier who had become his closest ally. A white man from the Midwest, Thomas had defied the unwritten rules of racial segregation, standing beside Elijah when others turned their backs. "We stick together," Thomas murmured as they took their seats in the crowded hold. Elijah nodded, hoping the battlefield would not break that promise. The ship groaned as it pulled away from the dock, the waves churning against the massive hull. The journey ahead was uncertain, but there was no turning back. Soldiers sat in uneasy silence, some murmuring prayers, others clutching small tokens from home, a photograph, a letter, a lucky charm. Elijah found himself tracing the worn edges of a small Bible his mother had given him, its pages creased from years of use. He wasn't a deeply religious man, but in that moment he found solace in its weight. Days passed in a blur of routine drills and restless nights. The men slept in tight quarters, their dreams haunted by the unknown horrors awaiting them. The sea was merciless, rocking the ship with relentless force, and many soldiers succumbed to sickness. Elijah remained steady, his body accustomed to hardship. He spent hours on deck, staring at the horizon, lost in thought. Thomas joined him one evening, both men leaning against the railing, watching the sun dip below the water. "You ever wonder if we'll make it back?" Thomas asked quietly. Elijah exhaled, his breath visible in the cold night air. Every day, silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken fears. They had trained for this, prepared for it, yet nothing could truly ready them for the reality of war. Then, on the 10th day, the alarm blared, a sharp, piercing sound that sent soldiers scrambling. The enemy was near, the time had come. Elisha tightened his grip on his rifle, his pulse steady. He had survived the battle of prejudice. Now he had to survive the war itself. Chapter 3. Fear of the First Battle. The distant roar of artillery sent shivers down Elijah's spine. The battlefield was nothing like the grand patriotic speeches had described. It was a wasteland of destruction, muddy trenches stretching for miles, the acrid stench of gunpowder and death hanging in the air, and the ever-present hum of fear running through every soldier's veins. The sky, once a canvas of hope, was now darkened with smoke, torn apart by the relentless barrage of enemy fire. As they moved forward, Elijah's grip on his rifle tightened, his knuckles turning white. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, his boots sinking into the damp earth, weighed down by the heavy burden of survival. He could hear the labored breathing of the men beside him, their collective anxiety forming an unspoken bond. Somewhere in the distance, an explosion ripped through the silence, sending debris and dirt flying into the air. He whispered a silent prayer, his mother's voice echoing in his mind, telling him to be strong. Then the attack came, swift and brutal. The enemy opened fire, their bullets slicing through the air like invisible daggers. The ground erupted around them, dirt and blood mixing in the chaos. Men fell, their screams drowned by the deafening explosions of artillery shells. Elijah ducked behind a pile of rubble, his heart hammering against his ribs. The metallic taste of fear coated his tongue, but he forced himself to focus. Beside him, Thomas Whitaker shouted commands, his voice barely audible over the cacophony of war. "Hold the line, keep moving forward!" Elijah's hands trembled as he raised his rifle, his finger hesitating over the trigger. The enemy was just ahead, faceless figures shrouded in smoke and shadow. His first shot rang out, the recoil jolting his entire body. He didn't have time to think about whether he had hit his target. More gunfire erupted, and he fell into the rhythm of warfire. Reload, take cover, move. Time lost meaning. Seconds stretched into eternity as the battle raged on. Elijah saw men fall, friends, comrades, some dead before they hit the ground. He heard their last gasps, their whispered prayers, their desperate cries for help. But there was no time to mourn, no time to grieve. War was merciless, and hesitation meant death. A deafening explosion sent him sprawling backward, his helmet flying off as he hit the ground hard. Dazed, he blinked against the dust cloud that enveloped him. A sharp pain shot through his shoulder, but he forced himself up. Thomas was beside him in an instant, grabbing his arm and pulling him to his feet. "You still with me?" Thomas's face was streaked with dirt and sweat, his eyes searching Elijah's for any sign of weakness. Elijah swallowed the lump in his throat and nodded. "Yeah. I'm not done yet." Thomas grinned despite the chaos. "Good, stay close, we're pushing forward." Elijah adjusted his grip on his rifle, steadying his breath. The fear was still there, lurking in the depths of his mind, but he refused to let it control him. He had come too far to turn back now. With renewed determination, he followed Thomas into the fray, bullets slicing through the air, explosions rattling the earth beneath them. The battlefield showed no mercy, but neither did they. For Elijah, this was more than just survival. This was the fight to prove he belonged, not just to his country, but to history itself. Chapter 4. Friends and Foes. In the heat of battle, alliances were forged in blood. Elijah and Thomas fought side by side, pulling each other from the jaws of death more times than they could count. They moved as one, their trust unspoken but absolute. There was no room for hesitation, no time for doubt, only survival. Yet, within their own ranks, not all were as welcoming. Some of their fellow soldiers viewed Elijah as expendable, his dark skin a mark of difference that, in their eyes, made him less worthy of the uniform he wore. The enemy's bullets did not discriminate, yet many of the men beside him did. The whispers, the sideways glances, the muttered slurs. Elijah had endured it all during training, and now, even in the thick of war, it persisted. He had proven himself on the battlefield, but to some that would never be enough. One evening, after a brutal day of combat, the soldiers sat huddled in the damp, rat-infested trenches, exhaustion weighing on their shoulders like a leaden blanket. The sounds of distant shell fire rumbled across the horizon. A grim reminder that the battle was far from over, Elijah sat quietly, methodically cleaning his rifle, his hands steady despite the turmoil inside him. A soldier named Corporal Dwyer, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a permanent sneer, eyed Elijah with thinly veiled contempt. "Why are you even here, Carter?" he scoffed, his voice laced with disdain. "This isn't your fight. What do you think you're gonna prove?" The words hit like a slap, but Elijah had learned long ago to control his temper. He clenched his fists, his jaw tightening, but he refused to give Dwyer the satisfaction of a reaction. Silence was often his best armor. Thomas, however, was not one to stay quiet. He set down his canteen and stood, stepping between Elijah and Dwyer. "He's got just as much right to be here as any of us," Thomas said firmly, his blue eyes locked onto the corporal's with quiet defiance. "He's fighting for this country same as you. Or do you think only some men deserve freedom?" Dwyer snorted, leaning back against the trench wall. "I just don't see the point," he muttered. "Ain't like things are going to change when we get home." Elijah finally spoke, his voice calm but resolute. "Maybe not," he admitted. "But I didn't come here just for home. I came here to fight for the man beside me, for the ones who never got a chance." Dwyer studied him for a moment, then spat into the mud. "Suit yourself." The tension hung in the air, thick as the smoke from the battlefield. But no further words were exchanged. The war did not allow for petty disputes. When the enemy attacked, they would all have to stand together or die alone. Later that night, as Elijah sat on watch duty, Thomas nudged him lightly. "Don't let them get to you," he said. Elijah exhaled slowly. "I learned a long time ago that if I let every insult get to me, I wouldn't have made it this far." Thomas smirked. "Well, just know you've got someone watching your back." Elijah gave him a small nod of gratitude. The battle ahead would be ruthless, but he knew one thing for certain: he had an ally he could trust, and in war, that was worth more than anything. Chapter 5. Chains of Prejudice. Despite his courage, Elijah faced obstacles. Beyond enemy fire, the bullets and bombs were not the only threats on the battlefield. There was an invisible war raging, one of prejudice and inequality. Orders were given to white soldiers first, leaving black soldiers to fend for themselves in critical situations. When supplies arrived, somehow, it was always the black units that received the least. It was a battle within a battle, fighting not only the enemy, but also the very system that was supposed to protect them. Elijah saw it firsthand every day. When food rations ran low, white soldiers received their portions first, leaving scraps for the rest. Medical attention was delayed for black soldiers, their wounds deemed less urgent. Even in combat, when backup was desperately needed, their pleas were often ignored. It was an unspoken rule: black soldiers were considered expendable. One evening, after an exhausting day of combat, Elijah's unit found themselves pinned down by enemy fire. The trenches were barely holding and the ammunition was running dangerously low. Elijah ran to the command tent, his uniform stained with dirt and blood, urgency burning in his veins. "Sir, we need reinforcements," he said, standing before Lieutenant Harding, a hardened officer who barely spared him a glance. Harding sighed, rubbing his temples as if Elijah's presence alone was an inconvenience. "Reinforcements are limited," he said dismissively. "We need to prioritize the units that can make a real difference." Elijah's jaw clenched. "Sir, my men are out there fighting just as hard as anyone else. We won't hold without support." Harding's gaze finally met his, cold and indifferent. "Look, Carter," he said, voice dripping with condescension. "You and your kind should be grateful to even be here. You're not exactly the backbone of this army." Elijah felt a flash of fury, his hands balling into fists. Every fiber of his being screamed at him to fight back, to demand the respect he deserved. But he knew how this would end if he let anger take control. So instead, he took a slow breath and forced himself to remain steady. "Yes, sir," he said through gritted teeth, turning on his heel and walking out. That night, as he sat with his unit in the freezing trenches, he relayed the grim news. No reinforcements. No additional supplies. They were on their own. The men grumbled in frustration, some cursing the officers who saw them as less than soldiers, but Elijah refused to let hopelessness take root. "We're not here for them," he said firmly. "We're here for each other, and no matter how much they try to break us, we hold the line." A murmur of agreement passed through the group. Thomas clapped a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Damn right," he said with a small, tired smile. Elijah exhaled, looking around at the men who had become his brothers. He would prove them all wrong. Not with words, but with actions. Because in the end, courage was not defined by skin color. It was defined by heart, by resilience, by the willingness to stand and fight even when the world told you to kneel. And Elijah Carter would never kneel. Chapter 6. A Test of Loyalty. The mission was dangerous, a night raid deep into enemy territory. It required stealth, precision, and unwavering nerve. Elijah was chosen for the mission, but not because of his skill or bravery. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Harding, saw him as expendable, a pawn to be sacrificed in the name of strategy. Elijah knew the truth, but orders were orders. Refusing meant court-martial or worse. As the unit gathered for briefing, the tension was thick. The selected men, mostly black soldiers, exchanged wary glances. The mission had all the signs of a suicide run, yet there was no turning back. "I'll go too," Thomas volunteered, stepping forward. Harding shook his head. "No, I need you alive," he said bluntly. Elijah felt a pang of frustration. Thomas was a skilled soldier, one of the best among them, yet the officer's words confirmed what Elijah had long suspected. Some lives were valued more than others. Thomas clenched his jaw, clearly angry, but Elijah placed a hand on his shoulder. "I've got this," he said, forcing a reassuring nod. As night fell, Elijah and a handful of black soldiers ventured into the darkness, their figures swallowed by the thick mist rolling across the battlefield. The moon provided little light, casting eerie shadows that danced between the ruined buildings. Each step was deliberate, their boots barely making a sound against the damp earth. Their mission: gather intelligence, sabotage enemy supplies, and return before dawn. They moved like ghosts, slipping past enemy patrols, hearts pounding with every rustling leaf and distant murmur. As they neared their objective, a ruined outpost just beyond a ridge, Elijah gave the signal to halt. He scanned the area, something in his gut warning him that danger lurked close. And then, gunfire. A hail of bullets tore through the silence. The enemy had been waiting. They had walked into a trap. Chaos erupted as men scrambled for cover, returning fire in the darkness. The air was thick with the acrid smell of burning gunpowder, the cries of wounded soldiers cutting through the night. Elijah hit the ground, rolling behind the remnants of a crumbled wall. He barely had time to process before a soldier beside him went down, clutching his chest, blood seeping through his fingers. "Fall back!" Elijah shouted, but the enemy had them surrounded. They had been set up, sacrificed like pawns in a game they never had a chance to win. Gritting his teeth, Elijah fired back, his rifle kicking against his shoulder. A bullet whizzed past his ear, so close he felt the heat of it. One by one his men fell, their bodies littering the battlefield. His mind screamed at him to run, but his heart told him to stand his ground. Then, through the chaos, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Another figure, hidden in the shadows, but not an enemy. A familiar face. It was one of their own. A white soldier from their camp, watching from a safe distance, a cruel smirk on his lips. Betrayal. The realization struck like a knife to the gut. They had never been meant to return. This wasn't just a failed mission. It had been designed for them to die. Elijah's rage burned hotter than the bullets flying around him. He had to survive, not just for himself, but for the men who had trusted him, for the ones who had fallen believing they were fighting for something greater. He would not let this be their end. With a final burst of determination, he turned to the remaining soldiers. "We make a run for it, now!" They moved as one, dodging fire, sprinting through the ruins, hearts hammering in their chests. The enemy pursued, but Elijah led them through a narrow passage, using the terrain to their advantage. One by one they escaped, though their numbers were far fewer than when they had set out. By the time they stumbled back into camp, exhausted and bleeding, the first light of dawn was creeping over the horizon. Thomas was waiting, his face etched with worry. He took one look at Elijah, at the blood, the dirt, the loss in his eyes, and knew. "Very sedasap," Elijah muttered, his voice low but filled with a fury that could not be contained. Thomas's expression hardened. "Then we make them pay." Loyalty had been tested and betrayal had been revealed, but Elijah was still standing, and now the real fight was about to begin. Chapter 7, the first glimpse of betrayal. The mission had been doomed from the start. What was supposed to be a swift and silent raid had turned into a bloodbath. Their intelligence had been faulty, or more likely manipulated, leading them straight into an enemy ambush. It was as if someone had sold them out, feeding them lies and sending them to their deaths like lambs to the slaughter. Elijah had known war was brutal, but this was something else. The way the enemy had been waiting for them, positioned in perfect spots to cut them down, suggested they had known of the attack in advance. The realization struck him in the midst of battle, as bullets tore through the night, striking down his fellow soldiers before they even had a chance to fight back. Someone from their own ranks had betrayed them. Through the chaos, Elijah moved with sharp instincts, ducking behind crumbling walls and dodging the enemy's relentless assault. The cries of the wounded echoed in his ears, but he couldn't stop, not yet. His rifle was hot in his hands, the recoil rattling through his bones as he fired back, providing cover for the few men still standing. But the odds were stacked against them, and one by one they fell. A strangled cry caught his attention, and Elijah turned just in time to see one of his comrades, Jackson, collapse to the ground, blood pouring from his stomach. Without thinking, Elijah sprinted toward him, sliding across the mud. "Stay with me," he urged, gripping Jackson's uniform as he hoisted him onto his back. The weight of the injured soldier pressed down on him, but he refused to let go. The journey back to camp was a blur of agony. Every step was a battle against exhaustion, every breath a reminder that survival was not guaranteed. Bullets whizzed past him, but he pushed forward, staggering toward the distant lights of their camp. The pain in his muscles screamed at him to stop, but stopping meant death for both him and Jackson. Finally, he stumbled into the trenches, his legs nearly giving out beneath him. Medics rushed forward, prying Jackson from his grip and laying him onto a stretcher. Elijah's vision blurred, his lungs burning as he sucked in ragged breaths. He had made it, barely. Then he saw the look on his commanding officer's face. Lieutenant Harding stood at the edge of the camp, arms crossed, eyes narrowed. But it wasn't relief that flashed across his face when he saw Elijah. It was something else. Surprise, disappointment even. The expression was gone in an instant, replaced by his usual mask of indifference, but Elijah had seen it. The pieces began to fit together in his mind. The faulty intelligence, the perfect enemy ambush, the officer's reaction to seeing him alive. Someone in their own ranks had betrayed them, and Elijah was starting to suspect he knew exactly who it was. His hands curled into fists, but he had no proof, only a sinking feeling that the worst was yet to come. Chapter 8. Alone on the battlefield. The next battle was brutal. The morning sun had barely risen when enemy artillery rained down on their position, shaking the earth beneath them. The trenches became a death trap, filled with smoke, screams, and the acrid scent of burning gunpowder. The roar of explosions deafened Elijah as he scrambled for cover, his heart pounding like a war drum. Then, amidst the chaos, he was separated from his unit. A sudden blast sent him sprawling into the dirt, the world spinning around him. Dazed and disoriented, he struggled to push himself up, but when he did, he found himself completely alone. The battlefield stretched before him, a wasteland of destruction. Bodies littered the ground, some groaning in pain, others deathly still. Enemy soldiers moved through the ruins like shadows, their rifles ready to cut down anyone still breathing. Elijah's breath came fast and shallow. He clutched his rifle, pressing himself against the remnants of a crumpled wall. His hands trembled, exhaustion creeping into his bones. He had no idea where his unit was, no way of knowing if they had retreated or been wiped out. All he knew was that he had to survive. A rustling nearby sent his pulse into overdrive. He turned sharply, his finger tightening on the trigger. An enemy soldier emerged from the dust, rifle raised. Time slowed. Elijah fired first. The recoil jolted his shoulder, and the soldier collapsed, the life fading from his eyes before he hit the ground. Elijah didn't have time to process the kill. More figures were approaching. He ducked into a ruined building, his breath ragged. His ammunition was running low, and he knew he wouldn't last much longer alone. He had to move, had to find cover, had to... A voice rang out through the chaos. Elijah. His heart nearly stopped. That voice. He knew it. He turned sharply, his eyes searching through the dust and destruction. And then he saw him. Thomas, leading a group of soldiers, rifles blazing as they cut through enemy lines, Thomas pushed forward like a man possessed. Relief crashed over Elijah as his friend reached him, eyes scanning him for injuries. "You look like hell," Thomas muttered, shoving an extra clip of ammo into Elijah's hands. Elijah let out a breathless laugh, loading his rifle. "You took your damn time." Together they fought their way back toward friendly lines, each step a desperate struggle against overwhelming odds. Bullets whizzed past them, enemy forces closing in, but side by side they pushed forward, covering each other, refusing to fall. By the time they made it back to camp, exhaustion weighed heavily on Elijah's limbs, but as he looked around, watching his fellow soldiers celebrate their narrow escape, the sense of victory was hollow. Because deep down, he knew the battle wasn't over. Someone still wanted him gone, and next time he might not be so lucky. Chapter 9. Trust Shattered. The night was eerily silent, broken only by the distant echoes of war. The camp, usually alive with murmured conversations and the clinking of gear, seemed frozen in a heavy stillness. Elijah couldn't sleep. His mind was restless, haunted by the battles fought and the gnawing feeling that something was terribly wrong. As he walked past the officers' quarters, he heard a hushed conversation, words spoken in low, urgent tones. Instinct made him stop. Pressing himself against the wall, he listened, his pulse quickening. "We held up our end of the bargain," a gruff voice said. "The fewer of them that return, the better," another answered. Elijah's breath caught in his throat. He recognized that voice, his commanding officer, Lieutenant Harding. Elijah dared to peek through the small gap in the tent. In the dim lantern light, Harding stood across from a shadowy figure. A man dressed in enemy uniform. Elijah's stomach twisted in horror. Betrayal. His mind reeled. Harding had set them up. He had led them into an ambush, sacrificed his own men, his own soldiers, for reasons Elijah couldn't yet understand. Rage flared in his chest, hot and uncontrollable. He had risked everything, fought for a cause that had already deemed him unworthy, and now the very man meant to lead them was the one plotting their demise. His first instinct was to rush in, to call Harding out, to demand answers. But reality hit him just as fast. He was a black soldier in a white man's army. His word carried no weight. If he accused an officer without proof, he would be the one punished, branded a liar, court-martialed, or worse. His hands clenched into fists. He had no power, no voice. But he had the truth. And somehow he would find a way to make it known. Chapter 10. The Unfolding Conspiracy. Elijah knew he couldn't do this alone. The weight of what he had discovered was too great, the risks too high. So, under the cover of darkness, he sought out the one person he knew he could trust. Thomas. They met behind the mess tent, where the shadows swallowed their whispers. "Are you sure about this?" Thomas asked, his face lined with worry. Elijah nodded, his jaw set in determination. "I heard it with my own ears," he said. "Harding isn't just working alone. There's more. I need proof." Thomas exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder. "If they catch us—" "I know," Elijah interrupted, "but if we do nothing, more of us will die." Reluctantly, Thomas agreed, and together they began their dangerous search for evidence. It wasn't easy. Harding was careful, and any soldier caught snooping around an officer's quarters could be charged with insubordination or worse. But Elijah and Thomas had been through too much to back down now. Over the next few days, they uncovered scraps of conversations, coded letters exchanged between officers, and supply reports that didn't add up. It became clear this wasn't just Harding's doing. There was an entire faction within the military, men who saw black soldiers as expendable, feeding false intelligence to ensure their deaths while keeping their own hands clean. The realization sent a chill down Elijah's spine. This wasn't just racism, this was a systematic betrayal, and the lives of countless black soldiers had already been lost because of it. One night, Thomas managed to swipe a document from Harding's tent, a letter confirming a meeting with an enemy informant. It was the proof they needed. But it also meant they were in more danger than ever. If Harding or his conspirators found out what they had, they wouldn't hesitate to silence them permanently. Elijah's hands tightened around the fragile piece of paper. He had spent his entire life fighting to be seen, to be valued. Now he had the chance to fight not just for himself, but for every man who had been deemed unworthy by those in power. It was a dangerous game, but Elijah refused to be another nameless casualty. He would see this through, no matter the cost. Chapter 11, Between Life and Death. Elijah knew that exposing the conspiracy meant painting a target on his back. But he hadn't expected the enemy to strike so soon. It happened under the cover of night. As he slipped away from camp to meet Thomas, a sharp rustling in the bushes set him on edge. Before he could react, a figure lunged from the shadows. The glint of a knife flashed in the dim moonlight, and a searing pain tore through his side as the blade found its mark. Elijah staggered, gasping as blood soaked his uniform. He swung blindly, his fist connecting with his attacker's jaw. The man grunted but didn't go down. Another slash came, barely missing Elijah's throat as he stumbled backward. The world blurred. His strength was fading fast. Then a gunshot rang out. The attacker froze, a look of shock flashing across his face before he crumpled to the ground. Thomas stood behind him, pistol smoking, eyes wide with fear and fury. "Elijah!" He rushed forward, catching him as he sagged to his knees. "Stay with me." Gritting his teeth against the pain, Elijah forced himself to stay conscious. "They know," he rasped. "They know we have proof." Thomas nodded grimly. "Then we're running out of time." Elijah clenched his jaw, forcing himself to stand despite the searing agony in his side. He had been warned. He had been attacked. But he was still alive. And as long as he was breathing, he would not stop. Too many had fallen in silence. Too many had been erased from history. He would not let them win. With Thomas supporting him, they disappeared into the night, determined to bring justice to those who had been betrayed, even if it cost them everything. Chapter 12. Betrayed by his own. Elijah barely had time to process what had happened before he found himself surrounded. A group of soldiers stormed into his barracks in the dead of night, their rifles aimed at his chest. He reached for his sidearm, but a sharp voice stopped him cold. "Don't move, Carter." The voice belonged to Lieutenant Harding. Elijah's blood ran cold. He had known the man was corrupt, had seen him conspiring with the enemy, but he hadn't expected Harding to act so quickly or so ruthlessly. "Under orders from command, you are hereby placed under arrest," Harding declared, his expression unreadable. "You are charged with insubordination, espionage and treason against the United States Army. Elijah's stomach lurched. "That's a lie," he spat. "You know damn well who the real traitors are." Harding's lips curled into a smirk. "Do I?" Two soldiers grabbed Elijah by the arms, wrenching them behind his back. He struggled, but he was outnumbered. His mind raced. This was a setup. They weren't just trying to silence him, they were trying to erase him. If they succeeded, his name would be buried in dishonor, remembered only as a traitor instead of a soldier who had fought for justice. Thomas burst into the room, his face flushed with anger. "You can't do this," he shouted. "You know Elijah is innocent?" Harding turned to him, his smirk never fading. "Careful, Whitaker. Defending a traitor makes you look suspicious, too." Elijah locked eyes with his friend. "Don't," he warned in a low voice. "They'll come to you next." Thomas clenched his fists but said nothing more as Elijah was dragged away. The night air was bitterly cold as they hauled him toward the holding cells. Every step felt heavier than the last, the weight of betrayal pressing down on him. Thrown into a dark cell, the iron bars slammed shut behind him. He sat in silence, his mind whirling. They had taken his freedom, but they hadn't taken the truth. He still had allies. He still had a chance. Elijah had fought battles on the front lines, but now he faced the greatest fight of all, proving his innocence in an army that had already condemned him. Chapter 13. The Search for Truth. Elijah sat in the cold, damp prison cell, his hands shackled, his mind racing. He had always known the odds were stacked against him, but now, staring at the 4 stone walls that confined him, he realized just how deep the betrayal ran. The weight of his impending fate pressed down on him, but he refused to break. They could silence him, but they couldn't erase the truth. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Thomas was running out of time. He had seen the corrupt system in action before, but this was different. This was personal. Elijah wasn't just a fellow soldier, he was a friend, a brother in arms who had saved his life more times than he could count. Letting him rot in a cell for a crime he didn't commit was not an option. Determined, Thomas began his search for undeniable proof. He scoured the camp for documents, intercepted conversations, and spoke in hushed whispers with soldiers who had seen too much but were too afraid to act. Each piece of information he gathered painted a clearer picture. Harding and his allies had orchestrated this betrayal, feeding the enemy information while sacrificing black soldiers to cover their tracks. One night, Thomas managed to sneak into Harding's quarters. His hands trembled as he rifled through papers and classified reports. Then, beneath a pile of neatly stacked files, he found a ledger filled with names, coordinates, and secret exchanges between Harding and enemy forces. It was the evidence he needed. It was proof that Elijah had been set up, that this conspiracy ran far deeper than anyone had realized. But just as he tucked the ledger into his jacket, the door creaked open. A shadow loomed in the doorway. Harding. "You should have kept your nose out of this, Whitaker," Harding said coldly, his hand resting on the pistol at his hip. Thomas's heart pounded, but he didn't back down. "You framed an innocent man, and I have the proof." Harding's eyes narrowed, but before he could react, Thomas darted past him, shoving him aside and sprinting into the night. Footsteps thundered behind him as Harding's men gave chase. Bullets whizzed past his head, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. Elijah's life depended on it. Chapter 14. The Fight for Justice. The courtroom was silent, the air thick with tension as Elijah was led in, his hands still shackled. The faces of the officers and soldiers around him were unreadable, but he knew the truth. The trial had been decided before it even began. The men who had accused him of treason were the same ones controlling the outcome. It was a performance, a cruel attempt to cement his downfall. But Thomas had other plans. As the trial began, the prosecution wasted no time in painting Elijah as a traitor. They twisted his actions, manipulated evidence, and ignored the truth. He was labeled insubordinate, reckless, and dangerous, a soldier who had turned against his own. The charges carried the weight of death, and Elijah knew he was fighting for more than just his freedom. He was fighting for his life. Then Thomas stood up. With the stolen ledger clutched in his hands, he strode to the center of the courtroom. "This trial is a lie," he declared, his voice cutting through the tension. "The real traitors are among us." Gasps rippled through the crowd as he threw the documents onto the judge's table. The evidence was irrefutable: transactions, coded messages, and a list of soldiers sent to die in planned ambushes. Harding's name was written all over it. The room erupted into whispers, and for the first time, Elijah saw doubt in the eyes of his accusers. Harding stood abruptly, his face twisted with fury. "This is treason! A fabrication!" he shouted. But the damage was done. Other soldiers, emboldened by the evidence, began to step forward. They spoke of orders that made no sense, of missions designed to fail, of men like Elijah sent to die, while Harding and his conspirators reaped the rewards. The tide was turning, yet justice came at a cost. As the court descended into chaos, Harding reached for his weapon, determined to silence the truth. A gunshot rang out. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. Then Harding collapsed, blood spreading across his uniform. A soldier had fired first, unwilling to let another innocent man fall. Elijah was free, but the war wasn't over. The conspirators would be dealt with, but the scars remained. He had won his freedom, but at what cost? He looked at Thomas, the man who had risked everything for him, and knew one thing for certain: justice had prevailed, but the fight was far from over. Chapter 15. The Unsung Hero's Legacy. Elijah Carter was free, but freedom did not erase the scars he carried. The war had ended, the guilty had been punished, and justice had prevailed, but at a cost too great to measure. As he stepped out of the courthouse, the sun warming his weary face, he knew that his battle was never just against an enemy across the trenches. It had been against the prejudice woven into the very fabric of the army he had sworn to serve. Though he had been exonerated, the whispers remained. Some still saw him as a man who should never have worn the uniform. Others regarded him as a troublemaker who had exposed the cracks in the system. But for those who had fought alongside him, for Thomas, for the soldiers who had come forward, for the ones who had not survived, Elijah Carter was something more. He was a warrior who had fought on two fronts and refused to be erased. He returned home to a country that still struggled to see him as an equal. His mother wept when she saw him, holding him tightly as if she could shield him from the world that had tried to break him. His father, the man of few words, simply nodded, his eyes betraying a pride he would never say aloud. But Elijah knew that silence did not mean ignorance. His father understood what he had been through, just as generations before him had understood the fight for dignity in a world that sought to deny it. Years passed and time moved on. The war became history written in books that barely mentioned men like Elijah. Medals were handed out, names were etched into stone, but some heroes remained unsung, yet his story lived on, not in newspapers or official records, but in the hearts of those who had seen him stand tall in the face of injustice. Thomas, now an officer himself, often spoke of the soldier who had defied the odds. Recruits listened in hushed awe as he recounted the tale of the man who had survived betrayal, fought against corruption, and never once wavered. And though Elijah Carter's name may have been left out of the grand histories, it did not matter. Because true legacy is not built in monuments or medals, it is built in those who remember. And Elijah Carter would never be forgotten.